All right, players, we are going into the off season here eventually. It hasn't happened yet because it's been so nice out. But going into the golf season, I think it's a great time to kind of reflect on your game over the last year and think about what you would like to have happen for you in the next year, in 2022. I do this every year. I do this all the time, actually. I think about it a lot. But I'm going to start off and just ask you one simple question. And I want you to give it some thought. I'm going to have you pause the video if you really want to do this and write down your answer, and then we'll maybe go through the rest of the video and then consider, if that answer is going to stay the same. So the question is this. Let's just say it's spring 2022. It's sometime in April. You've got beautiful weather day. Maybe it's a weekday, and all of a sudden you find yourself with the afternoon off. Your meetings got canceled, and you decide you're going to go practice for 2 hours on your golf game. What I'd like you to think about for a second, maybe write it down, is I want you to think about what would you do in that 2 hours? How would you approach it? You're going to drive to the golf course, you got your clubs with you. What are you going to do in your 2 hours of practice? How are you going to break it up? And write it down, and then come back to this video. I'm going to pause it right now. All right, hopefully you wrote that down. Now, I would contend that how you decide to spend that 2 hour practice time, the way that you think about it, is going to be a huge factor in how much improvement you see this year. So it's not something that I would take lightly. I rarely just drive to the golf course to practice without having a pretty specific game plan. So, we're going to put that sheet away for now, and we're going to come back to it. We're going to see if after this video, if you approach things a little bit different. So the first thing that I like to do before I write down any practice plan or any game plan for a day or a week or a month or even a year, is I step back and I look at the game in 5 different areas. Now, the majority of the shots that I hit on the course fall into these categories. I've got driver, tee shots, approach shots, mid-range wedges, which is any non-full swing wedge, but it's not still a short game shot. So a mid-range wedge would be, for example, I hit my lob wedge stock 100 yards, anything less than that, but that's still not like in that 5, 10, 20, 30 yards around the green. That range, say 40 to 100, is going to be my mid-range wedge category. Once we get around the green where we're starting to hit real small shots, that's all short game from the rough, from the fringe, from tight lies, even from the bunker. And then putting, of course, is the final category. So you've got these 5 categories, and they all are, I would say, quite a bit different. You can probably, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. How you drive it and how you putt it, those are totally different skills. How you chip it and how you hit a full iron shot are totally different skills. So, there's these games within the game of golf that you need to kind of focus your attention on each of them somewhat individually, because they all require different skills to be successful with. All right, so I've included a little worksheet in this email. You can certainly print it off and work along with me here. I would recommend maybe color coding them. I'm going to use 4 different colors as I'm analyzing my own game here, and hopefully you can follow along. I'm going to use green for good, and just means good enough for what you want to have happen, good enough for your skill level. It doesn't mean green means you're a tour player. It just means that relative to your skill level, you're not worried about that aspect. So green, good. Yellow, that's not yellow. Yellow means we don't really know enough about it. So a couple of these as we go along, I'll explain what might be a yellow one. Orange is something that might be a bit of a weakness or something you want to pay attention to. And red is going to be something that, is definitely an issue, costing you shots on the course. So we'll go through the first one here, driver, and I kind of have these ordered in order of importance. It's not like the end-all, be-all tier list, but generally speaking, more important at the top, less important at the bottom. So for driver, first question you got to ask yourself is, how's your ability to hit the sweet spot? Is it good? For me, I usually hit the sweet spot. Maybe I toe it a little bit, but it's not like costing me that many shots very often. So in general, I'm going to put a green check mark next to sweet spot. If you don't know whether you hit the sweet spot or not, you can always get a can of foot powder spray down your face, hit some shots, see how well centered they are. Hitting the sweet spot has a huge, is a big determining factor in how far the ball goes, which direction it goes, which direction it curves, and all kinds of stuff. So it's pretty important skill area, and it's something you need to at least know if you're good at it, and if you're not good at it, that might be a orange one or even a red one if it's really killing you. Especially if you're hitting the edges of the driver very often, topping it, popping it up off the toe of the heel, that's definitely red. Face direction with driver, this has to do with the direction your ball goes. So if you have a really wide dispersion, missing it way left and way right, that might be a spot where you might put a red check. Now, for me, I used to have this problem with the driver. I called it the driver demons, where I really horribly struggled with face direction. So that's been a bright red area for a long time for me. Now I've fixed that problem, but I still want to stay on top of it because I've solved it, but you know, it was really bad, and I want to stay on top of it. So I'm going to put orange there. That's something I'm going to continue to focus in on in practice. Curve okay. That's like, do you have a functional curve on your drive? So think about your good drives. Are they curving a lot? Would you say too much? If they are curving too much, it probably has something to do with the path of your club. Isn't direct enough down the target line. But just know that if it's curving a lot, you're definitely costing yourself some distance. It also makes it harder to hit the sweet spot if you have a path problem. So for me, when I'm hitting it with the driver, my curve is generally fine. That's not a problem. Launch and spin. This is where you might have a yellow question mark if you don't know like your kind of average numbers. Obviously I use TrackMan, so I have an advantage there. I get to see launch angles and spin rates and all that stuff. But if you don't know your launch angles or spin rates, or you really don't know if they're good or bad, that might be yellow. That might be something you might want to learn a little bit more about. We can definitely do that in a lesson. Hit some on a launch monitor, see if there's any major differences or major problems there, because if there are problems here, those are definitely going to cost you some distance. You might spin it too much and lose distance, or you might not launch it high enough and not be able to carry it far enough, etc. So because I practice a lot, I know mine, and they're pretty optimal. Finally, on driver, club head speed. It's good to know what yours is. If you don't have any idea what yours is, that might be yellow. You might want to ask yourself, you know, do I want more? Can I get more? Am I already trying my hardest to bump that number up? For me, I swing it pretty fast. I'm around 117 to 120 miles an hour, which, you know, the ball goes pretty far, 350, 360 in Colorado with the rollout. But even then, I mean, I'm greedy, so what can I say? I'm gonna put a yellow there. I wouldn't mind a couple more miles an hour. And I think for most players, especially if all the other stuff is pretty good, you know, a couple more miles an hour equals a lot of yards. You pick up, say, 3 miles an hour, that's 10 yards. That's probably one less club into every hole. So we're going to go through this with all of the other categories here momentarily, but we're going to think about it in those terms. All right, moving on. I'm just going to go through these kind of quick. So approach, we've got, you know, these are our shots out of the rough or out of the fairway. You know, most of the time they're irons. Important things to pay attention to. Turf contact. For me, this is not a problem. You know, once in a while I'll hit them on a little heavy or a little thin, but it's not very common. It's not consistently killing me. If you do chunk and thin some, you should pay attention to that. Sweet spot, that's another one. I'm going to give it a green for me, but you might not know. It might be yellow if you've never tested it. I find a lot of players, I use this foot powder spray. You spray it on the face. Oh man, that's probably a mistake. You spray it on the face, hit some shots, see where it's hitting, and you know, just know where it's at, if nothing else. In my experience, a lot of players are, you know, extremely toe biased or heel biased without even knowing it. If you do struggle with maybe an occasional shank, there's a good chance it's a little bit on the heel. So might be a yellow if you don't know it. If you I would definitely do that before you put a green mark there. At least spray the face down, hit some shots, see where it's at before deciding. If you do find yourself shanking it very often at all, off the hosel, for example, it's definitely a red. That means, you know, once in a while it's a shank, but most of the time it's probably on the heel. Face direction on the irons, that's just a matter of, you know, how good are you at hitting them on target, you know, within the scope of the green, for example. For me, that's one that isn't great. I'm going to put a orange one on there. tend to miss a couple too many iron shots off target. I tend to hit them left. So that's an area for me that I'm gonna pay attention to. I might even make that red. That's one of my biggest problems. I mean, it's not like it's all the time, but every round of golf, I will be inclined to hit 2 or 3 short irons, you know, way off target. So that's gonna be a red check for me. Trajectory, that's, you know, do you hit your irons too high, too low, just right? If you don't know, put a yellow check mark there. If you're pretty comfortable with the height, the ball seems to be stopping reasonably well on the green, then you can put green there. And if it's way too high or way too low, then it's costing you shots. That might be a red or a orange. And do you know your distances? I do. I've got my distance chart right here, and it's pretty in depth. So, you know, you don't have to have this amount of precision in yours necessarily. I've got my stock yardages, how far I hit them with my normal swing. I have, you know, my max distances if I gun it. I've got my chippy distance. That's for me. I feel like with my irons specifically, I've got my stock swing, I've got my gun swing, and I've got my like neck high 90% swing that take a little bit of distance off. And then I'm a freak, so I put one on there for sea level cold conditions because I have a tournament coming up here in February, so I've got my distances there as well. But if you don't have any idea, it's definitely red. If you think you need more knowledge about it, it's orange. You know, if you are pretty confident in your distances, then it's green. Same kind of things apply for the mid-range wedge. That's those 40 to 90 yards, whatever the number is for you. You know, do you make good turf contact? I do. I don't miss-hit those very often. Do you hit the sweet spot? I find I tend to hit the hosel, not shanks, but I tend to get a little hosely on those. Do I control the face well? I tend to pull them. Face gets a little closed. My direction isn't great. My launch and spin numbers are optimal. I launch at about between 28 and 30 degrees. If you don't know that, put a yellow mark there and we'll test it. That's actually a really good one to test inside. And then how's your distance control? Do you have the ability to hit, you know, 70, 80, 90 yarders? You know, for me, I'm good at it, but I really want to be better. So, you know, I probably have 2 or 3 around. I'll put that on the other side. I probably have 2 or 3 around where, you know, I'm trying to hit it, say, 80 yards and it goes only 70 or 90. And I do hit a lot of them close, but I'm not as consistent as I want to be. And when it comes to consistency, it's like, you know, for some of these, you might be able to do some of these some of the time, but if you miss in an area often enough to affect your score consistently, it's probably red. All right, short game, round the greens. This is short game type of shots. These are the things you would use at the short game area at Omni. First question, how's your turf contact on tight lies? When the grass is, you know, closely mown, fringe, fairway. If you struggle with that, obviously make a note. For me, I don't really struggle with that. Luckily, I used to really badly. I used to really almost had the chip yips for a couple of years where, you know, I would face a tight lie and get real nervous about the contact. So yeah, give that some thought. Out of the rough, same thing. Are you judging the rough well? Can you get the club through the rough? I do, luckily. In the sand, I rarely miss-hit a sand shot. I mean, not often enough to worry about it. Can you control your trajectory? Can you hit? I like to at least have 3 different heights. I like to be able to hit it low, medium, and kind of high. Can you do that off of both rough and fairway or tight lie? How's your distance control? This is one that I'm going to make a mark on. Most of the time I hit it pretty solid. I usually hit the trajectory I want. If I do make a mistake, oftentimes it's here. I'll hit it a little shorter, a little longer on my target. It's not enough to kill me, but it's definitely something I can work on. And then finally, the judgment of your landing. So this one, you can kind of think about it like this. If you hit a short game shot and it lands about where you want and it doesn't end up close to the hole, that might be a judgment error. You might be missing something there. You might, the ball may have spun and checked more than you expected, or it may have released more than you have expected. When you practice, if you're working on this, you got to use real golf balls, or the golf balls that you use. Range balls do not react how a real ball does. And to be honest, anytime I see a good player put in a mega session on the short game area with a bunch of range balls, it's like, it makes me cry inside, to be honest, because they're just not getting the most out of their time. So if you feel like that's something that's a problem, make sure you've got like 10 or 15 shag balls that are, old balls that you've used, so that you can see actually how they do launch and spin. Because like I said, a range ball launches way higher and spins way less on these short shots. So give that some thought. And for me, that's a pretty good one. Finally, putting. Big things here in putting, skills to consider. We've got speed control. Are you good at it? Do you have a method? Green for me. Generally speaking, my putting's pretty solid. Do you hit the center of the face? Have you ever checked it? You can use gate drills and things like that with tees. I do hit the center. You might not know. You might just want to test it one day, and if it's fine, give it a green mark. Face direction. That you would know you'd have a problem there if you miss your start line. So if you're over a putt, and I find this on, typically more important on shorter putts, inside 10 feet, if you don't hit your intended line and push it or pull it, then you probably have a face direction problem. For me, this happens rarely, maybe once every round at the most. I don't really have a problem with that. For a lot of you, green reading and aim is a big one. You've got to ask yourself, do you have a method? Does it actually work? Have you ever tested it? Obviously, if you take lessons from me and we talk about putting, you've probably talked to me about this at some point. If you haven't, let me put it this way. If you haven't talked to me about green reading and aim, make it yellow. You don't know. You might even think you're good, but you don't know, most likely. For me, that's good. And then, does your ball come off smoothly? Does it have a lot of hop to it? That's something you can kind of see if you can video it, or I have a roll board that you can do a quick test on in one of our future lessons. So now we've gone through the whole thing. All right, I'm putting the markers away for a second. Okay, so now we've gone through the whole thing, and I've circled the big areas of focus for me. So I'm looking at these different categories. I'm looking at where the most reds and oranges are, and I'd recommend you do the same. Anything that you have that's yellow that you don't know about, let me know, and I can either help you in a lesson, figure out the answer to that. A lot of times, if it's yellow, that means you don't know. For example, if your launch and spin rates are good, or if the ball is rolling smooth. Like, we can check that really quick. It's more of a checkpoint if it's yellow. But if it's green, we're not gonna really practice it much. So like any areas that are green for me, I'm not gonna spend any of my time practicing. This goes back to that original question. Going back to that original question for a second. So let's just say on your sheet, you wrote down, I'm gonna spend 40 minutes of time of that 2 hours. I'm gonna spend 40 minutes of time doing short game, 40 minutes of time doing putting, and 40 minutes of time doing driving range. Let's just say that's an example. You are probably not being efficient with your time, and you're not gonna get as much bang for your buck as you should from that practice time. For me, looking at this sheet here, you can see the putting is pretty much green for me. Putting doesn't give me much trouble. Like, I'm not gonna spend any time, like zero. Not even gonna hit a putt probably when I practice. My putting practice, at least unless something changes, will likely consist of the 5 to 15 minutes of warm up before the round of golf, where I'm just getting a feel for the speed of the greens on a given day. But I'm not gonna practice this if I've got other red areas or orange areas, okay? And I recommend you do the same. If you have an area that you're really comfortable with, don't waste any time on it. You got other stuff that you can focus on that you're gonna get more out of. So for me, if I was making a practice schedule, my red areas are face direction on irons. So I'm gonna do some training with my irons where I'm trying to change the face direction, get it going more right, get it going more left, find that middle ground, see what kind of feels I need to figure out for that. I'm gonna spend, you can see the mid-range wedges, got a lot of oranges and reds there. I'm gonna spend a lot of time working on my distance control, my direction, and double check my contact. If I was going to work on my short game, I would just be focusing on distance control. Maybe I'd put some targets out there at different distances and try to hit different trajectories to them. And then with the driver, it is really important. I will definitely still be hitting some drivers in practice, focusing in on face direction sense. Even though it's good now, historically for me, that's been my biggest problem. So I'm just going to stay on top of that one because I know that's mission critical for me being a good player. And I'm going to do some things, whether it's with my swing or in the gym, with how I train, with some overspeed training, weightlifting, etc. Do some things to see if I can bump up the club head speed a couple more miles an hour. So my 2-hour practice would probably be, call it 40 minutes of mid-range wedges, 40 minutes of face control on my irons and approaches, and 40 minutes of driver, just controlling the face and checking my club head speeds. So that's a lot different than doing a little bit of everything. In that sheet, you can do this on your own. You feel free to share the results with me. We can talk about them in a lesson. But I think if you spend your practice time on the areas that you identify as the most problematic, we'll call it the low-hanging fruit, the things that give you the most trouble, the things that cost you the most shots, that's going to be how you get to the next level with your handicap, with your scoring, with your golf goals, as opposed to working on stuff that doesn't need a whole lot of work. Like, why would I bother spending any amount of time putting if I'm already putting fine, right? I can't overemphasize that enough. All right, let's wrap this up. Now, my list doesn't have a ton of reds and oranges. I've got a lot of greens that I don't have to worry about. Yours might look a little bit different. Yours might be full of yellows, in which case we need to talk so we can figure those out. If yellow means you don't know. Or every area might have reds and oranges in it, and that's totally fine. I would actually expect that. What you want to do, though, is pick just a couple for a practice session or a series of practice sessions and focus just on a couple of those things. So you might have reds everywhere. What you're going to do next is like pick the 2 or 3 areas that you feel cost you the most, and generally speaking, start at the top of the list. These are somewhat in order of importance. So, for example, if you're talking about mid-range wedges, if your turf contact, and it's the same for approaches, if your turf contact is inconsistent and you find yourself chunking and thinning it, then some of these things a little bit farther down the list don't matter as much, or you can't really work on them that well. So if you're chunking your wedges, you can't work on distance control just yet because the contact is so inconsistent. So my advice would be to pick, like I said, pick 2 or max 3 areas that you focus on in the practice session. Start at the top of the list. If you have a red, so for example, if you're red in turf contact, that's your area of focus before, say, trajectory. You're not going to worry about trajectory until you can, quit mishitting it. And narrow your practice that way. You might have a huge list and it might seem like a lot to work on, but just pick the 3 things or the 2 things that cost you the most on the golf course and spend the next session, week, month working just on that, reevaluate, and then maybe you'll say, okay, I got better at this, now I'm going to work on the next piece, or I'm going to switch my focus over to here, or something like that. Last comment, you can look at that original sheet if you did actually pause the video at the beginning and wrote down what you would do in practice. Think about whether or not that's going to look the same after watching this and thinking about your game in this respect. Some of you, my guess would be, might look kind of the same, but I think a lot of you will probably maybe have a little different approach to your next practice session. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have questions or feedback, and I'll look forward to helping you in 2022.